Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail. This is a series of panels that we do on our Critics page each month. This month is our first in the year of the pig, so that's cool. This month's panel is it's called Downturn New York. And Daniel asked a very poignant question in his introduction to this section. And the question was basically to point out that New York City has been at the forefront of the global art world since the turn of the last century. Can it maintain that mantle if artists can't afford to live here any longer? That's the question that we're going to hear discussed in a variety of capacities this evening. And I'm just going to let you know that the way this evening is going to unfold is that the panelists will speak for about an hour. There will be about a half an hour for questions or statements, and then we will wrap it up and have drinks. So without further ado, I give you Daniel Palmer.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you, Bonn and Brooklyn Rail for having us here tonight, and for giving us the opportunity to contribute to this wonderful new issue of the Brooklyn Rail. It's out now, the February issue. I was able to read a lot of the other articles in it, and it's a really, as always, really strong product, as it were. It's a really important magazine, in the New York City art landscape, and we were talking about it on the walk over here. The sort of is maintaining the avant-garde culture that I think New York City is so well known for over the years, and I just thought it was important when Fong and Natalie and I were talking about contributing a critics page to really dig in and ask some of these questions. And so the conversation tonight is about the changing nature of the city and the challenges that is creating for a lot of creative people and for artists. Partly, as you put it, Charlie, about the sort of the challenges, the fact that it's really expensive and artists are having a tougher time living here. But at the same time, I hope tonight that we'll be able to talk about the sort of flip side of that, like the opportunities as well, because I don't think tonight should turn into kind of like a sort of misery session. And I don't think that the situation that we're currently facing is entirely a situation of like all is lost and that we need to always be frustrated. So I hope that we can kind of look at this thing partly with some real rigor and to talk about the challenges and the problems, but also with the optimism that I think artists and creative people often bring to some of the most difficult circumstances that we as human race often face. So I think also that I'm really incredibly grateful to the authors who contributed to the section, and I was thrilled to be able to bring together 4 of them for the panel tonight. And I think it was a really nice sort of grouping where everyone was sort of playing a different part in a way that really brought everything together really nicely, addressed the topic from a variety of different angles, and I thought that tonight's panel would really kind of allow for a really well fleshed out conversation to address this from a variety of different perspectives. So let me give a bit of a introduction to each of the 4 panelists who joined me on stage here, and we can get into the conversation a little bit more. So I have some formal biographies here, and I'll sort of add a little bit of a personal note to each maybe as well. So Wilson Sherwin is a doctoral candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center, where she is completing her dissertation, which is titled Rich in Needs, the Radical Imaginary and the National Welfare Rights Movement. She's also an activist who is involved in and leading CUNY's union, waging a campaign for living, which is currently waging a campaign for a living wage for adjuncts, which is really important. And seriously. first met Wilson, really, as I know her as well, when I was at the Graduate Center as well, and was also doing adjunct work, and so all the more reason why what she's currently fighting for is so important. And we'll get into a lot of the other things that she's incredibly knowledgeable about in New York City. Lisa Cooley is a New York-based art advisor and was the founder of Lisa Cooley Gallery. And I think that gallery was so important in terms of seeing so many shows and learning about so many great artists, and all of the wonderful work that you did there really was inspiring for me when I was just first starting out as a young curator. And I always knew that not only was I going to see something great on view at the gallery, but was going to be able to have a nice conversation with Lisa about these young artists that she was really doing such an important job of fostering their careers and really engaging with the issues that they were working on in such a thoughtful way. And John Newman is a New York-based artist and an instructor at the New York Studio School and the School of Visual Arts. His sculpture, drawings, and prints are represented in numerous public collections, including MoMA, the Met, the Whitney, the Tate, among many others. And John was actually an artist who I met in the first show I really ever curated, which was called Decenter, that I curated with a very close friend of mine, Andrea Campbell. And it was one of the first really serious, I don't know this artist, studio visits I ever did. And in your studio that you, your past studio that you wrote so thoughtfully about in this essay. And it really was, this moment where I was like, oh wow, this is a really serious artist. We're really gonna get into it. And I just know that anytime I do a visit with John, he's gonna show me something really beautiful and fascinating and important and new, and we're going to have a great dialogue about it. So thrilled to have John here tonight as well. And then Siona Ravi is a Brooklyn-based writer, and she works at the Center for Urban Pedagogy. And Siona and I actually worked together previously at the Public Art Fund before she now has this great job with the Center for Urban Pedagogy. And when we were working together there, she was just always so incredibly thoughtful. We were working on lots of research projects, which actually a lot of the work we were doing together really significantly influenced my thinking about the issues at play here in this Critic's page. So, and that she engaged with so thoughtfully in her essay there as well. So. Really to be up here with this group, and maybe let's just start to get into it. I've been talking a bit. I think it's so incredibly important that we are coming together and to have you all in the room, and we really look forward to your insights and questions at the end as well, because this is such an important moment. One could think of this really as a pivotal moment, a sort of where the world around us, and especially the city, has changed so drastically. I think it's an important moment to start to think about the dialogue that the rail certainly is always at the core of, and that we I think really need to be engaging with in a moment like this. So I first, maybe to kind of set the scene, want to talk and understand a little bit more about what exactly, maybe we should sort of work to put our finger on what exactly is it that has changed recently. And I would love to have you, Wilson, kick off to talk about how the city exactly has changed. You wrote about the city's infrastructure and about the sort of the administration, how these things have changed it. Do you want to sort of set the scene a little bit?
Happy to be here. So I think maybe I could set a little bit of a context for what the kind of crisis is that's animating this issue and Dan's thinking about this. It can be hard to remember from our vantage point today, but in the 50s and 60s especially, New York City had developed what was the closest thing that the US has ever had to a robust welfare state. We had the biggest public university, which was free and had open admissions, both at the same time for a brief few years. We had a massive system of public hospitals, one of the biggest national public housing systems. We had a functioning transportation system which hadn't raised fares in 40 years, a huge municipal workforce which was unionized and paid good wages, all which sort of made all of this run, right? And I think that we're used to thinking of New York as a real innovator, especially in the cultural realm. And sometimes we forget the ways that New York was also a huge innovator in some really sort of disheartening ways. So faced with a massive fiscal crisis in the early 70s, New York City innovated what has become a kind of global strategy of austerity politics, right? So how do you deal with fiscal crises? New York City was the first one to really test this out. And the way that it did this, which it has then very generously exported to countries across the world, including Greece, including what we're doing in Puerto Rico now, is by slashing public services, right? Closing hospitals, closing firehouses, imposing tuition at CUNY, raising the fares on transportation massively, right? And I think that much of what we are still grappling with today, what we are still really reeling from, is the fallout of this very dramatic one-sided class war that was imposed on New York in this era, especially in the 70s. And I think that it's important to remember that crises are not they are not predetermined and they are not neutral. They are, what happens from crises, right, is the outcome of political struggles. And I think that as a radical, as growing up in New York City was actually a really kind of remarkable lesson for me in thinking about how to manage crises. I grew up in the experimental theater world in the 80s in downtown New York. And I think that this has sort of given me two lessons for thinking about how we can conceive of crises, right? And that there are two really big things that I took away from this. And the first was this sense that another world is absolutely necessary, right? Especially in the downtown theater world, I'm sure many of you all remember this, just the sense of sort of the brightest and most wonderful minds dying in masses, right? Largely, really kind of exacerbated because of this slashing of public services and the sort of lack of healthcare that people had access to, right? And this is just sort of one of the many examples that New York teaches us from this era of how desperately we need a different world, right? But also growing up in the Lower East Side, in the theater world, was this really kind of incredible, powerful, constant reminder that not only is another world necessary, but it is very much possible, right? And I think that artists give us this kind of entryway into thinking of different worlds and how we conceive them and how we might arrange them. And I hope that we can sort of think through that more with some of the creative minds that are in the room today.
Do you want to add to that, John? And just in terms of specific, no, okay. Just in terms of that sort of specific transition, you know, you have been living here through a lot of that as well. I mean, in terms of the sort of tangible feel of it.
Well, I can certainly tell you all kinds of tales about when I arrived as a young artist in the early 70s. You want me to do my little spiel now, or I thought Lisa was kind of...
Yeah, I mean, well, just
I mean,
in terms of the context of this, I think it's helpful to understand a little, you know, a little bit of the long view of an artist.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. Well, I want to say one thing first before I even begin, and that is I just read Mary Gabriel's 9th Street Women, and I encourage you all to read that. It's an amazing book, all about the women of the abstract expressionist period, but It's beautifully written in that the social political foundation of the art world is talked about in a wonderful way and informs how all the artists live. And in fact, there was a certain freedom that many artists were able to benefit from because no one really was interested. And although I would never want to disagree with, was it Bonn, who said that New York was the center from the beginning of the 20th century. The book is all about that kind of moment where there's the competition between Paris and New York, where New York becomes the center, and that's basically in the late 40s, early 50s. And what I was very impressed by with the book, and I'll get to the next stage in a second, is everyone found a studio very easily. There was no problem finding studios. There was no problem getting cigarettes, coffee, and going to the automat. Nobody had a job. And if they did, it was mainly the women supporting the men. John Newman, for example, Lee Krasner even. Everyone was drinking, everyone was able to make their work at every level, no matter if you were de Kooning, who was folklorically well known, he wasn't showing his work, to the second generation that pops up where they begin to talk about Joan Mitchell and Grace Hardigan and Helen Franklin. Anyway, the reason why I'm saying that is because when I arrived in New York in 1971, it was very clear to me, because I was very involved with an older generation of artists, because I came as a college student, I got credit to supposedly be an assistant of an artist. Basically, it was all bullshit. Got the guy. It was Solo Whitney. He signed my paper and allowed me to do whatever I wanted to do and told me not to bug him. Although he did get me a job sweeping floors at the John River Gallery, which had just opened up in the 420 West Broadway building in 1971, I believe. And I think there was 6 galleries in Soho at the time. I rented a loft and I sublet it, and everyone in the building was furious with the people who sublet the space to me because they charged me $200, and no one had ever paid more than $100 a month for a loft. And what happened was, I shouldn't say I realized, it was quite an accident, but it's a timing issue, and this is why I think this thing that we're talking about tonight is so important, because this time, I had a fantasy when I was 17 years old about being a poet, and then I sort of transitioned into conceptual art because somehow poetry seemed a little stuffy from my Oberlin days. And basically, it had something to do with my will and my drive, I'm sure, but it had to do with the fact that I got a really cheap, huge loft. I didn't have to have a job. I didn't do sheetrock. Many of my friends would do sheetrock for 3 months and paint for 6 months. And this is the way you could do it. And you hung out at the bar, and then each bar was like a different club. And the bars were very important, and I want to really, I don't know how much time I'll get, because I could keep going on and on, but I think the most important thing for young artists now, because the art world is so huge, diverse, and the market has caused this strange skew on what the goals are. The most important thing are for young artists to find small communities with each other, to keep talking, to help each other, to network, which is a horrible word. But when I arrived here, I was 19, it was tiny, and you would go after all the galleries closed at 6 o'clock, you'd go to the Spring Street bar. Some people went to Finelli's, they were more like the hard drinking crowd. And, there was Smithson, there was Andre, there's Dorothea Rockburn, and, I was a kid, but I had something to say. And you could approach them, and I got to be friendly with many of them, and it created a conversation, it created a tone. And that tone also created a sense of freedom. Like you actually could be, like in the 50s, although different. I never had a job. I had grants, I had part-time teaching, but there was a way that you could be an artist in a way that now my 24-year-old assistant who just graduated from SVA, who's an incredibly talented young woman. She has a tiny little apartment that she shares with 6 people. She has a studio the size of this table that she shares with somebody. She works 5 different jobs, trying to find a little bit of time to be in the studio. I mean, it is a very, very difficult time. There's no question about it. And, it's all about the culture at large, the market in the art world, the hugeness of what's going on. And that's all true, and we all feel that. I think the one thing I really want to say in kind of closing, that I'll get back to it when we discuss it, is it is so beautiful if you get to be able to do what you want to do. And that's the most important part of being an artist. And that's why it's so important that you figure it out. And everybody figures it out in their own way. And I believe that this 24-year-old and her cohorts will figure it out in a different way. I have to say, and this is a slightly different subject, but in the last 20 years, I've been working smaller and smaller and smaller, and I have all kinds of things to say about that in terms of scale and the history of art, but I think it's something that has to do with now. People live in smaller places with smaller studios, and they also have a sense of space that's mainly virtual and not actual. So the whole idea of a kind of a model, or as I like to say, sacred object for a secular world, is something that you can construct in front of you. It doesn't have to be the giant spectacle of too much money or corporate money. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I didn't want to be a corporate guy. I can't believe that artists have turned into corporate people. My studio manager, and I have 90 assistants. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the thing is, you get to do what you want to do if you can, and that's the most beautiful thing that happens. And I think that will always continue. Always continue. But indeed, I was fortunate to be born at a certain time, and lofts were cheap. You didn't need a job. You could eat. You had friends. It worked very well. And I think it stays the same, but it's like fractals. It just changes in scale and in depth and in complexity. It's never going to change. And the reality is it's changed drastically.
Thank you. Yeah, I think also you started bringing up the art market, at a few points. And so maybe, Lisa, it would be really helpful to hear your take on the sort of like maybe the boogeyman in the room of the conversation of this world changing, of New York City changing, and specifically of the art world, the creative part of New York changing. Because I'm curious also if there are aspects of it that also Wilson has thoughts on as well about capitalism, its role in this whole conversation. But I'd love to hear, specifically about how, your thoughts on how money in the art world. I mean, it's always been there, but specifically how it's had an influence on this.
Well, I think that money is part of the thing, but money can't exist apart from scale and apart from attention. And those are the things like. Sorry. Money doesn't exist apart from scale. I think it's less an issue of money in the art world and more an issue of how scale affects financial decisions. Because, and I just a couple of examples, like collectors are bombarded with images, and how can you make a decision about what artwork to buy when you're presented with 500 artworks in the space of a weekend? Like that's just, and it's almost an impossible, like you can't, if buying art is a emotional decision, and even for the people that might just be buying for financial reasons, you still want to like fall in love with something. It's maybe a spectrum, right? There's still a little bit of emotion in how you pick one art object versus another object, but when you are just bombarded with artworks, it reduces your ability to make slow, careful decisions. And you tend to go with, I just think it diminishes your capacity to make more thoughtful decisions. Another thing that's changed is that the people who are buying art now all work. Like the percent, I wish I had this exact figure at hand, but of the people, of like the people that have like the top level of people with capital in the United States, or it might be globally, but let's just stick with the United States. It used to be that they didn't work, that they could go to a gallery and sit down with a gallerist and talk to them for hours. There was more time for them as well. They could, sit down with Paul Cooper and look at every transparency that Solowit had made of all of his works and get a whole great sense of it. And now I think even among the richest people, some figure like 80% of them derive most of their capital from working. So that also says something about the astronomical salaries that are being paid to top level workers, which is another issue. So I think that it's a very complicated thing, and I don't think you can just say that it's about money. It's about scale, it's about attention, and about how people how that affects how people make decisions. I think,
Is there an opportunity to encourage people to slow down?
I mean, I think that's a question about how do you do that with the entire society and with your life and every facet, not just in collecting art.
Well, in the old days, that's what art was supposed to be for, to a certain degree.
Maybe this is actually a moment to hear from Siona specifically about the role of the artist and the opportunity, for the artist in the challenges of, that we've just been describing, and specifically of the problems that we're currently facing in the city.
Sure. I think for me, it's hard to talk about just artists and not everyone else in New York that's also struggling, not just for me, but I think that everyone, of course, is facing the problems of rising rents and gentrification. And I think that at least one of the questions that Dan posed to me that I'm going to paraphrase and butcher a bit was what it is about the city that inspires me today. And that was really daunting because it was hard to think, it was hard not to think about the glaring inequities. And it was also hard not to feel naive when just focusing on the good things that are happening. And I think that approach is just wrong. And I think that the artists that I'm really moved by today are the ones that are working outside of the realms of that binary, right? The ones that are specifically community engaged. And the kind of work that they're doing doesn't just reveal that there are inequalities in the city. I think that we all know that art can be used to share stories and uplift narratives of people. But I think that the kind of work they're doing reveals that in spite of all of these systemic inequalities that are at play, there's so many, the communities are so resilient, and there's so many counter systems that they've formed themselves. And these kinds of collaborations that artists are doing, art is being used to form some of those systems, but it's also being used to reveal that for a long time, some of these changes aren't that new, that the communities are still resilient and fighting against them. And I'm thinking specifically about, maybe I'm taking this to a different direction, but I'm thinking about the sanctuary movement today and how the New Sanctuary Coalition started this project called Sanctuary Hood. And a part of that was just acknowledging that even though New York City is legally a sanctuary city, it's not, right? ICE still conducts raids everywhere. It's still a police state. It's a dangerous place to live for any immigrant. But what this project is doing is educating local business owners, artists, activists on how to turn a block, like your neighborhood, into a sanctuary space. And so that kind of like counter city that they've formed, this like counter sanctuary space within this like fake sanctuary city, is really powerful. And I think that that kind of change and like that, the role of the artist there is to not just like, it's not really about the artist anymore, right? It's about like that process that's being created and the fact that like, yes, there's so many like horrible systems at play, like all the systemic violence. And I think when we focus so much on that, we're kind of letting it win. But I think that while that's happening, there's simultaneously so many movements that have always existed, and artists can kind of strengthen them and move them forward, if that makes any sense.
One thing that I've been extremely overjoyed to hear, just with you guys all talking is, and I think a great thing about being somebody working in the arts, and thinking about all these issues right now, is that there are always problems, but there are, right now it feels like people are actually thinking about them and figuring out how to solve them. And the conclusion that I've come to seems to be a very similar conclusion to what you guys have come to, which is that the overall problem is a problem society. So that's where it needs to change. Like it's not something that specifically affects our world, it's all the opportunities that you're talking about are things that artists need, but there are things that writers need and that like human beings need. And if that changes, I think just slowly there's just this amazing collective awakening happening about the desperate need for intense political change. And that's amazing. And I don't think I realized what a conservative society we lived in before. And I do, and it's all I think about now. I almost really just, the art world is my business, but I really just think about how society needs to completely transform.
I agree with what you're saying. I want to say one really funny thing. I hope it's funny. Because Lisa's saying the art world is my business, and I'm sure it is. When I first got to New York, and I met a lot of young artists who I wanted to, and I was meeting older artists, etc. Nobody ever used the word art world. There wasn't the term art world. Art world now has subsumed what art and artists do, because it's this umbrella that has become, it's more market-driven, money self-conscious, status self-conscious. I have a canned line that I always say to my students, which is sort of more like enthusiastic, but I think it relates to that. And this is more about the artist as individual than the culture as a whole, which I do believe is the big problem, and also influences artists, of course, but ultimately, it's better to be interested than interesting.
Well, you're both, John.
No, because wait, that's not the point. Interesting is projection of what you think they want you to be. Interested is your passion, your focus, your engagement. And I think that we're gonna have like a little binary situation here, because I think it's very important that we talk about the social and the larger picture. We're all aware now of how conservative it is in this country and how much that's influencing things. But one thing I don't want lost, and I do think this is being lost, is that art's about the individual. It's an individual's expression. And yes, individuals make up a moment, a movement, a culture, but at least as artists, we're one at a time. And that kind of focus and passion and intensity is what really drives the boat. It's not the art world.
Yeah, look, I think related to that is the monolithic culture that is so bombarding that I think you were talking about in the specific, Lisa, we're talking about in the specific of getting a lot of PDFs sent to you, but I think it's not any different from having a ton of, emails sent to somebody who's not.
Right, it's a systemic feature of every aspect of our culture is just information overload and it's the same for her, like peak TV. There are more premier quality TV shows that you can stream all at once. It's in every aspect of culture.
Yeah, and I think it's partly necessary in a capitalist system where you have to buy or subscribe or invest or whatever to keep it going. But I think at the same time, you are entirely right, John, in the sense that the solution to that is actually to kind of recenter and to come back to the moment. And I think, the inspiring art projects that you were talking about, Sienna, are one way of really when you boil them down, it's about person to person, about, artists as people who can see the world in a different way and can really connect directly to people. Or if you're talking about more formal art, simply the experience of standing in front of a painting is, for me at least, one of the absolute most recentering and inspiring and beautiful moments that I have in my day, week, year, to be able to just kind of immerse myself in the beauty of that brushstroke or that color yellow, and to have, or a poem, and to have a place for my mind to be inspired, and I think that is a challenge in a system that kind of wants to yank us out of those reflective moments and to make us go, faster.
It used to be called consciousness raising, but that's an old sentimental term.
Do you want to talk about activism in this moment as well, and how that really is a kind of a way forward, or a moment for connection or inspiration or change?
Sure, yes, I think I'll get to that. I want to touch on something that John said though about the kind of the individual and not losing that. So Keynes in 1936 wrote this wonderful essay, A Letter to My Grandchildren, in which he envisioned that in 70 years, we would have solved the question of scarcity, right? We would have figured out how to get everyone everything that they need, and people would basically have to work maybe 4 hours a week in order to meet all of their needs. And one of the reasons why this was so compelling to him was that for all of human history, we've been so concerned with this struggle of scarcity, right? Of how do we meet our basic human needs? And that once we had resolved that question, we could finally start to really get into the real rub of humanity, which were the questions that we, as humans, are really capable of asking and answering. And that it wasn't until we resolved the problem of scarcity that we would really be able to get into the heart of those questions. And I think that when you talk about the sort of individual and his practice, I think that that is absolutely sort of what we aspire to, but that without addressing the question of scarcity, that people have a really hard time getting to that, their individual potential, right? That is the creative essence of what humans can do. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the question of creativity and the arts is a deeply social and political question. I also think that, one of the things that you touched upon that I also see is the way that the arts can inform activism. So one of the things that I found especially moving about the West Virginia teacher strikes last spring, that were really these very militant, the unions were totally taken off guard, right? They wanted everyone to just go back to work and be quiet, and these radical women were just no, we've had enough, and they articulated it very clearly as a struggle against austerity, not just for their own wages or for their students. And a number of them were talking about they had had no experience in activism before, they were sort of new to this. And someone was asking them, well, how did you figure out how to do this? You waged this massive militant strike in a red state where it's illegal to go on strike, and none of you had any experience with activism. And one of the teachers said, well, I was the stage manager. And so, you know, as a stage manager, you know how to make anything happen, right? And I think that's one of the kind of remarkable things about what the arts teaches us, right? It's like, how do you build the weird thing that you want to build? Well, you just make it happen, right? And that bringing that kind of spirit to our activism is really enriching and really remarkable, right? And that's when we win, is when we just figure out how to make it happen.
That's wonderful. And I think in a moment where we are in, I don't want to say like we're not in a genuine crisis. I think we are in a genuine crisis right now, and I think it's going to get worse, and I think it's really hard for a lot of people. I think we need to figure out how to make it happen. And that's what I wanted to ask, you know, at first your story sort of sounds, John, your story kind of sounds a bit depressing, but I think at the end of the day, you know, in our conversations and in your piece, there's a real, like, it's not even a glimmer of optimism, it's like a beam of optimism where you're at right now. I'd love to hear a bit on that. Why are you optimistic? What do you know, what's the future for this crisis?
Well, I suppose I have two things to say. One is sort of my own personal story, and one would be my, how could I say, my caring for younger artists, because I've been very involved with younger artists. I've been teaching forever. I love to teach, although I've never had a full-time job, thank God. Even when I was at the head of Yale, I was only there 1 day a week. In my personal story, I would say I had the magic of my loft, which afforded me the freedom to be the artist that I always dreamed I could be. Meaning I had a gigantic space for no money, and it allowed me to kind of get by on smoke and mirrors and grants and things like that. And occasionally, you know, I got some attention and sold some work for up and down periods, etc. Honestly, I think, and it's an interesting moment for me to be here tonight and talk about this, because tomorrow I'm moving out of my studio of 40 years. I'm moving 100 crates of sculpture. I've been in the same space for 40 years. I got pushed out by an aggressive landlord who's knocking the building down. But I've been very fortunate in that I did find something pretty good. I'm sort of shocked. So I'm very optimistic about that. But my own personal optimism really comes from, and this is going to sound kind of corny, but you know, I don't care. I'm now about to be 67, but like when I was 65, a number of people I knew were getting sick, and people were dying, and people are getting old, and I was always a very cranky, ambitious, younger artist who expected more and bitched about this and that. And, you know, most artists I know are like this, frankly. They're all narcissists and complainers, and, you know, why them and not me and all that. But honestly, when I turned 65, I thought, okay, this is my last chapter. And I don't mean that in a morbid way. I don't think I'm dying tomorrow, right? By any means. But I thought, if I can't make this good now, this is my fault. I was always that, you know, New York Jewish kid, Woody Allen, you know, the glass is half empty, not the glass is half full. And I really had an apostasy. I mean, it's great to be an artist. I mean, it is fantastic and thrilling. And it's what I always dreamed of. So, like, how bad is that? Now, with younger artists, I feel it's very interesting, because this is how I met Dan. I met a group of younger artists in there at then, what was it, 5, 6, 7 years ago, who were in their 30s. Now they're all in their about to be 40s or late 30s, and they have a very different model. They all have little apartments, little studios. Some of them have galleries, some of them are accomplished and sell their work, some of them don't. But now they are not young artists anymore. And the world has changed again. And I'm really concerned about the next couple of generations, particularly my students who are in their 20s, because I'm not sure if how far outside of Bushwick can you go? For years ago, people were going to Berlin. Now, last night I met an artist from Berlin. He said to me the exact same thing we're talking about now, that Berlin is New York.
You go all the way to Iowa.
Well, I heard people going to Warsaw.
Some optimism, John.
No, but the optimism is in the art part. I do think that the culture, what would you call it, the infrastructure that's available to young artists is so difficult that art will change. I mean, I think that's optimistic. But no, honestly, I'm not that optimistic for young artists who work 5 jobs so that they can have an hour in their studio. I think it's really difficult.
Sione, can you tell us about the Lover's War?
Sure.
And I think then.
Sorry, Dan, I couldn't believe
That's
it.
okay, yeah, okay, and then Lisa's got one.
So the piece I wrote, I referred to this James Baldwin essay called Creative Process. And he talks about the role of the artist as this incorrigible disturber of peace, and how the artist always has to sit away from society and observe what's going on, but use that distance to kind of prod and question it. And even that, I mean, James Baldwin is talking about really tense moments in history, and that can also still feel bleak, right? That the only thing the artist is trying to do is fix this broken society. But what Baldwin says is that, I'm going to paraphrase this, but he talks about that relationship between the artist and his society as a lover's war, and how that this desire to change it and question it and raise consciousness, as you said earlier, comes from this like deep, deep love from the place that they're from and the people that are in it. And that sounds kind of corny, but why else would people be trying to change the place they live in if they didn't love it? We'd all just move to Iowa or Berlin or all these other places. And maybe because I'm young, I can still like fixate on that like love for the place as what drives things, but James Baldwin can feel that optimistic, that I think we can too.
I'm gonna tell you a quick story. I had a moment where that completely changed a lot of my thinking about art. When I was pregnant, I have a son who's gonna be 5 at the end of the month, and my husband works in the research library at the Frick collection, and he went in to talk to his HR manager about paternity leave, and he said, my wife is gonna have a baby, and we're trying to figure out what we're gonna do. And she said, oh, of course you're gonna move to New Jersey, aren't you? And his immediate reaction was, I did not move to New York City to move to New Jersey. And he came home, we're both from Texas. He came home and told me that story, and we laughed about it. And I kept thinking about it, and I kept thinking back to why I moved to New York City in the first place. And I remembered being 14, 13 maybe, and somehow I have no idea how it was the received idea and culture that I got. I always knew I wanted to be here. And I just, in that moment, that moment of fantasy that you have when you're creating yourself, I understood that to be the exact same, the same impetus that drives people to create art or to make change in their life or in their society. And that's something that never goes away. I think it's impossible to cut yourself off from that. You might repress it or maybe not take that part of yourself seriously or write it off as being childish, but that moment of fantasy when you're dreaming about what you want to be and what you want to become is incredibly profoundly powerful, and you have to recognize that, to not diminish it, and to hang on to it. And that gives you the conviction to do anything at all. And that's something that that is just a quality of being a human being that a city can't change. And that's why I love this.
Better be interested than interesting.
The other thing is that there's a book that I would always give to any of the artists that I work with, to just as encouragement. There's a woman named Joan Alcacella who writes for the New Yorker. She's a dance critic, and I think she also writes about literature for the New Yorker. And she published just a compendium of her essays of really just her New Yorker columns that were frequently reviews of biographies of like Mikhail Baryshnikov or any other number of Italo Svevo, any other number of mainly dancers and writers. And she usually takes that moment to go into their life and to talk about all the challenges that they faced in order to create their work. And in publishing this, in her introduction to her volume, she said she realized that what all these artists have in common are qualities that you don't necessarily expect artists to have, like ego negation, tenacity, perseverance, and things that she called Sunday school values. So, and if you read this, it's beautifully written. The way she writes is just fabulous. They're just New Yorker columns, so you can like dip in and dip out. It's incredibly inspiring because you talk about everything that we're going through. What some of these other people went through is mind-boggling. Like the writer MFK Fisher, I don't think she was able to start writing until she was in her 50s because she was taking care of her. She had to be a caretaker for her father. It's been a long time since I've read that, so some of the details might not be correct. But I think that that I'm optimistic because I know that their artists are incredibly tenacious people, and it doesn't mean that it's easy. But if people want to get something done, chances are you will probably come at least pretty close to finding a way to get it done. And my third reason I'm optimistic is that in order to solve a problem, you have to be able to identify what the problem is and talk about changing it, which is what we're doing. You can't solve a problem if you don't admit there's a problem.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. I think it's a good moment to open it up to questions and comments. Yes.
I'm curious about what people think about the idea of like a woke disinterest. Like in other words, what you were talking about in terms of stage managing, it's an aesthetic, right? It's an aesthetic to stage managing. And to a certain extent, to put yourself in the position of a stage manager for a social situation, it's an aesthetic move, right? And I'm just wondering if there's a way for, how artists might think in a disinterested way about what they might, or maybe ego negation, right? They might have to think about their distance from their work to get the work, to get some sort of traction with the work that's other than just projection of their ego. I wonder if there's when you were talking about the stage manager, I was just thinking about the fact that you could probably do that in a social situation, suspend your own disbelief. And it makes me think of like the Bartleby story in Bartleby the Scrivener, where he sets up this, he's in this copyist office down on Wall Street, and then he sets up his own aesthetic, which completely it completely overturns the kind of neoliberal like situation in that office, and it completely confounds the system. So maybe it's a way to deal with capitalism.
So you're talking about aesthetics and revolution together? That's a great topic to talk about.
I was like thinking about stage management, and when you're an artist, you do kind of stage manage your life in a way. It's not that you're like a fake, but it's like you have a responsibility to develop a a specific aesthetic, and, you know, you develop that, and then it becomes a lever.
Totally, I mean, it's a way of non-verbally expressing your ideas, and I think every, you know, there are just great fashion moments and aesthetic moments that go along with every kind of revolution, and I think it's a way of expressing this fantasy. I mean, if you want to create change, essentially you have to create a fantasy of like what you have to have an idea of what kind of change you want to create, and it probably has some style.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, maybe it demands like a suspension of disbelief. You know, maybe it demands like something abstract.
I almost think in a way it sort of demands the opposite, like a real intense commitment to it, a belief that what you're doing, you know, in terms of stage managing, as you know, is the term we're using, that it really is. No, I think it was good to bring into the conversation, but I think it's about doing that as if your life depends on it, because it really does.
Right, I didn't need to talk about aesthetics in terms of like a substitute or, you know, I'm talking about it as like an active, subjective.
Well, I think there are two different things, like one is ego negation, and another is like an expression of the individual as an ego, and I think that for me, ego negation is like not getting so bummed out when you get your 10 projection. But expression of an individual vision is essential.
I just have to interject something here that you're talking about aesthetics and revolution. And if I could get rid of aesthetics there and just interject creativity. Creativity is revolution.
Here.
Yeah, sure, here.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, you know, I don't
Remember creativity then, don't worry about aesthetics.
Yeah, I think we're at an interesting moment here where I think social activism is rising, at least maybe on both sides. And I think that's a great thing. But I don't want it to subsume another idea, again, back to the individual. I think that art, at least great art or good art, is political or social, I guess, in that it is consciousness raising. And that's where it all begins. So, you know, that's why I don't want, you know, in this, I think there's a lot of guilt right now in the art world about different kinds of necessities for social activism of a certain kind. And I think that the individual and the individual producing work that can hopefully generate this kind of consciousness raising is a really important aspect, not the full story, but a really important aspect of, I call it the revolution, although when I was in college, we called it the revolution in 1969, that's what we called it. I mean, the revolution sort of ended in that way. But I think the separation that we've seen, this kind of binary difference about art, aesthetics versus social activism, or the community is, I think it's much more intertwined than that. And it always has been, and it must be. And to separate it is where it gets weak. So, you know, I think it's all about consciousness raising, and that's what we all need. And that's one reason why you're making the art. And in many important ways, that's one reason why you're consuming the art.
Other questions?
Well, I'd like to follow what Lisa Wilson said. In some way, both brought this desire of the community and why you come to New York in the first place. We all have this desire to become somebody. You don't just come to New York and watch this and even people do that. It was a new sound else. I remember first meeting on cars like your generation who built their job to keep themselves afloat. But it wasn't any attention per se. Now the only other you have no one ever can afford to bring up they say, I remember, I went to school, Boston, when someone there, they have very obvious, very high optical systems that the main line up without the wealthy area. They always ask where you come from, meaning that. In Boston, that's cool. In New York City, they always ask, no, what actually, and I was asked that, and I remember, in 86, he's still getting incredible walk as a lumber. He was well, but he's not enough, look at, no, so that was not really why even given the first place, which brought home things back to Wilson, post-war America, or was here in international, New York City School. And in fact, in the last one, we had the artist foundation, mostly international, with one exception, second generation, Franklin. But I brought up the question that Joy asked me, a great book, New York School Cultural Record. In the author's notes, he says, my favorite philosopher is Guernica. I particularly like his statement, his boundless content to those like psychoanalysts who try to explain the flower by fertilizer. So in other words, knowing the artist's ambient doesn't quite explain his or her own work, but there's an inherent contradiction. When you think about the abstract expression, it's still somewhat a mythological community for us, because they bind together this community that, that welcomed the immigrants, so to speak. The community is Dutch born, in 1924, 27, I can't remember exactly. Gorky, Armenian, that's not his real name. That was sort of self-invented after Maxim Gorky. And Rothko was Lithuanian born. Maybe Poland, in a way, is not exactly European, but he's from Cody, Wyoming. Came to New York and whatnot, and the rest of them was really a group of individuals who came to New York for that very similar reason. And all of them belong to the school, the New York school. I'm not so sure abstract expressionism is the correct term, or action painting is the correct term. You can't really identify Rothko or Newman as an abstract expressionist. But yet they all have a community. They went to see the bar, they have the artist club that Philip Claudio founded, and then later Irving Sandler ran. For a long time, they came together, just like what you expressed. They came together and they have talk, they have a community. This is exactly what we're doing here. But I know it's super difficult for people, because technology had such an amazing power to separate people. Distraction, you're bombarded with distraction. Just try to describe, even the collector don't have the time to sit down and contemplate the book about to buy. People, I noticed that, even my own staff, they have to block out the noise by music. They have to text here and there. I only recently got the cell phone for the first time. I think it's super painful. But I have to do it, and we all have to adapt. My question to you guys, where do we go from here? Because New York City, just as this building here, when we did the sandwich show, which is a mere reason why we have this free rent, is an amazing testament of bringing people together to do something meaningful. The artists have two-sided coin. One is the need to be in complete solitude to create the work of art. But the other side, they can be blinded by their own complacency, completely removed from reality.
Complacency or complicity?
Both. So where did that go? I always remember Morandi. So he has incredible early phase, he was a fascist. When he would make metaphysical painting, he was submerged completely into the mobilization of fascism. But then when that failed, when he realized the political impulse was wrong-footed, he retreated into the solitude, almost serene contemplation of the bottoms, completely moved. So my question is that how can one mediate? How do you know what you're doing is worthy? To me, that's exactly why we came to New York for, to be worthy of something, to have a dialogue. You only have a dialogue when you have a worthy subject on earth to discuss with your friend or whoever you are confronted with.
Yeah, but Tom,
That's the question.
I think the crux that isn't being discussed enough is the notion of the poetic.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned, when you mentioned de Kooning, I remember the quote de Kooning said he came to America from Reed Whitman that he stowed away because he couldn't imagine a place that you could watch a spear of grass grow, right? That you'd have to leisure time. And what everyone's talking about that is gone is the idea that one would have time, and that's a social construction. People came to New York because it was a place, Jack Whitney talked about this, that it was as restricted as it was and as unopened as it was more open than most other places. So it was a place of somewhat defined time and freedom to make work. And that restriction now, which is a political kind of social idea of the value of things, I mean, there's very little talk about, just the necessity to make work. Work has changed. I had a talk with Mel Bachner once because I have this personal theory that kind of minimalism came out of this idea that all of a sudden all these artists had these big white empty spaces they painted them white downtown, as opposed to New York City School. They were actually more interesting spaces. They were smaller, but they had all the details in the building. They had some character, right? Mel said it's an interesting, not really. But I just wonder how that constriction of space and time actually changes work. So the work now, a lot of the work of younger artists, which I also deal with, is about trying to make work. It's not about work, it's about the idea of making something, right? So the idea of sitting and contemplating, no one has the time. So people hustle to get a show, and then once they have a show, they find someone else to give them a place to make the work. And they make the work for that show in a week or a month, whatever it might be. So the work isn't contemplated, but it goes back to the de Kooning thing is, where can a community exist?
Well, I appreciate your comment, Sam. That's, by the way, the Associate Dean of Yale
No, I'm not.
for a long time. He just left, but he had taught forever, which will come back to you for that question. My question again is following up again. This notion of the decades, the different decades in America, has been an amazing observation for me because it seems that it's a pendulum swing. If it swings too far to the left, it goes to the right. And it goes to the right, too far to the right, it goes to the left. And I remember reading anti-intellectualism in America, Richard Hofstadter, and he talked deeply about that condition. It's like almost like a cowboy suit out in OK Corral. You shoot me, I shoot you. So the point was, if you think about the decade of the 50s being the triumphant America, when America itself involved in the war and having been triumphant, the decade of 50 was the utopian, almost what had failed in Soviet Union, had been supplanted in America in the fall, I think sometime in September 1948, was when CIA was invented. In the same week or two later, suburbia America was invented. In fact, in Long Island, the potato farm, John and Alfred Levitt. So my point is, that was a repressive measure because after Expressionist paintings was being promoted in abroad, in Europe. It went everywhere. But in America, it was condemned.
Idealistic.
So painted, exactly. So it already had an incredible dualistic reading of what was being made, the art being made in America. My point is the
Are there any
60s
women who would like to ask a question or maybe make a
I got one.
comment?
I got one real quick. I mean, whatever. The binary aside, you said the word crisis at the beginning, and then the word crisis came up again, and there's a book called Call, which is by Tikan from like Anarchist Collective, and I'm wondering, like, they talk about not managing the crisis because capital wants us to manage the crisis. So I guess like if we're talking about rent and 5 jobs and sanctuary hoods, which I want to know more about, like how do we create things that don't just manage the crisis?
No question.
Do you want to also ask your question? Maybe we could like take a couple at a time and
Yeah,
think them through as
well,
we.
I mean, I actually was interested to know, which was something that Fawn asked but never was received an answer, there was no space for answer, but was that mediating of what to do next and the essentially mediating the private, internal, and the community aspect and what you see, what you in your own lives, what's happening there, and how you see this producing the kind of world that you need to see, that we need to have, has to happen together.
Absolutely.
And I had a reflection, and so I'll end up in a question, but when you were talking about the individual and thinking about this past, and just something that happens to me a lot as like a visitor of this city, as someone who very much know that wouldn't be part of that romantic past or like wouldn't be in that bar. And then I was thinking about, since we have been discussing politics around all these subjects, and then my relationship as someone who's on a visa here and doesn't count as the individual with political agency in this location, and it's like then the work has different concerns, but doesn't have that individuality, and then I kind of like carry this social aspect within it. And then to think about what's good about this city, and it's fascinating because for me, New York has been a city of a lot of people who don't belong, who are in this like space where they might end up in different places. And I was so glad you mentioned Baldwin, just like think back of like who were the other individuals that were just around, but perhaps not counted in these conversations. But New York becomes a space of like different languages and people in passing and conversations lost in translation. And like perhaps that's where there can be poetry within it, within the failure of like what is supposed to be communicated. And I don't know if that's utterly hopeful, but I think it is urgent. Because sometimes I wonder when we're thinking about thinking politically about here and 50s here, we kind of forget what was happening at the same time in other locations, or these visions of future when people don't have to worry about finance, that it include other people who would suffer more. And then sometimes I'm like, perhaps the whole hope is like that we'll be in this room to speak up too, or there will be someone who's like, oh, does someone else want to ask questions? Yeah, I'm around
You mentioned earlier that there's a word, art world, we don't use that word anymore, but I was thinking that.
I said nobody used it back then.
Back then, sorry, nobody used it back then. And I was just wondering how it seems like to me, I don't know, maybe it's just me as viewer of art, we don't seem to use the word collective anymore, or maybe we are and I just haven't seen it, but I don't know, do you feel like it's the opposite where nobody used that word then, but it feels like back then they used to use that word a lot more, and nowadays I don't hear it as much.
Well, actually, I do think like one of the things that Fawn was saying before about, the whole 50s ethos and all that. I mean, the Brooklyn Rail is one of the few things around or left that, as Dan said earlier, I'm not sure if avant-garde is a relevant word anymore, but like that it's not about the art market or what drives the art market. It's a community-based thing and it's free. Right? That's the biggest message, that it's free. And maybe that's part of the collective. When I was in college, we all were against hippies and collectives and co-ops and all that, and that kind of idealism has gone because of the intensity of work. But from my memory, everything changed in the early 70s, and it was feminism. Feminism changed everything. And it changed the art world because suddenly this tradition and mythical world of the 50s and all the guys, whether they were the macho ones or the intellectual one, Newman versus Pollock, or whatever you want to talk about it. But when women started saying, we're here and we're in it, and it was absolutely, it was undeniable. And then as more and more inclusion came in with more and more different groups, I think what happened was, and this is, I think, a really sad thing, and this is a little bit, I hope it's not cynical, but it is a little depressing. And that's why I think a discussion like this is actually very optimistic, potentially. But I think with more and more inclusion came a kind of, there was no more mainstream authoritarian body of judgment. So whether it was the Pope or Clement Greenberg or Art Forum in 1972, there was a very strict, clear authoritarian body of judgment. When I was a young artist and you came to New York, of course there were people painting figures. And of course there was the hairy who, but no one was paying any attention to it. It was Judd. And then what happened was when women sort of stepped up, and I mean not just in the art world, it was across the board. I remember being a student at Oberlin, T. Grace Atkinson came and created with Jewish Chicago the first women's groups. And no one had seen anything like it before. And I think that suddenly that changed consciousness. Now, that's a beautiful thing. That's the political benefit of both art or, finding yourself, particularly in the collective. But I think what has happened by default is nobody wants anymore to be, or no one will let anybody be, an authoritarian body of judgment, with good reason. Look at our president. But the default authoritarian body of judgment is the market. Why are you laughing?
Because that's kind of a very silly thought that nobody is letting anybody be an authoritarian.
No, I'm saying, I don't mean letting, I mean more that there is no longer a way to have a mainstream, singular authoritarian body of judgment, at least in the arts.
You mean because there are so many channels of information?
Yes, there's so many different kind of styles and medium and techniques, and it's that, and that's a beautiful, it's like the physicists that talk about the universe as a suds of universes, that we are no longer a singular universe. We are no longer a singular community. And I think that's a really beautiful, healthy biodiversity metaphor kind of thing. But the problem is that there is a default authoritarian body of judgment, and that's called money. And that's skewed it all. Or at least it's skewing it for this moment.
I have something to say about that.
We have to wrap up, so I'd love to end on a positive note.
Yeah.
Lisa's gonna bring it home.
Oh.
Lisa's not gonna bring it home. Is there anyone else who wants to bring it home on a positive note?
Oh, actually,
Let's have the break.
you have so much to say, you're not saying it.
Go. Okay, very quickly, for the two activists we have on board, the title of this talk is, what is New York if it cannot sustain artists? So I'm very curious from your guys' angle, how do we make New York someplace that is more welcoming to artists? What are the social structures, the laws? What's it gonna take to give people the room to be able to create a rich culture in this city?
Thank you, Sarah. Let's the question.
I think that a lot of the things are excitingly sort of a part of public discourse again, and maybe speak to your question of how do we not just manage the crisis, but how do we move towards something bigger? And I think that maybe a useful heuristic is the idea of non-reformist reforms. And I think that universal healthcare and housing as a human right and a living wage or maybe a universal basic income that enables people to actually be artists or activists or whatever else they may want to do. Fucking on peers is what I advocated in my article. Yeah, I think that those kinds of non-reformist reforms that give people access to the time and capacity to create the kinds of things that they want. And we do need to think through more what that really means, what non-reformist reforms are, right? How do they think things that really build our class consciousness, that make us aware of who our adversaries are and who our allies are, right? That those are ways that we really shore up our strength, and that's how we sort of build our capacity. And then a lot of those kind of basic, obvious reforms will help us to do that better.
I don't have too much to add to that, but there's an activist, Grace Lee Boggs, and she talks about how right now we're at a time when people of color are going to be a majority in many parts of America. And so that's something that hasn't happened before. So she poses the question, she doesn't have an answer. I'm sure she does, but it's a question she poses to her readers and says, okay, so now what? So now when people of color are going to be the majority, what's the America they're going to envision? And she talks a lot about how it's not just about fitting into white America. It's not just about like finding a job and getting equal pay in the same systems that exist, but now that you have this majority, what else can you imagine? And I think that that's where art can help.
Thank you all for the panelists. And
We have one more question.
I think we're over time, unfortunately. And we can continue informally. And thank you so much to Bob, Charlie, Booker, the book.